Because there's beards and like I can remember if you have a hipster lumberjack beard, that might be a little difficult. But if it's just a close shaven, pretty short beard, then it's probably going to be better.
Yeah. And as far as I know, I think the opinion describes Alexander Smith's desired beard as short.
It's a quarter inch. He's
Right.
very specific about, like, I think he wants, like, a big, bushy, like, Old Testament beard, but his compromise position is I'll grow a quarter inch beard so you can still put a thing on my face.
Right. Yeah. A quarter inch does not sound bad at all. I don't know. But I've never worn an air mask, so...
Though neither does Alexander Smith.
That's true.
Can we talk about the retaliation claim in this case? Because the retaliation claim, I think, is amazing.
A New Jersey firefighter says his religion requires him to wear a beard. His employer says that means he can't fight fires. But does that violate his right to religious liberty? We'll discuss that case from the Third Circuit, plus statutes of limitations hijinks in the Fourth Circuit, this week on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Wednesday, June 18th, 2025. And although the podcast will come out in a few days after tomorrow is Juneteenth, so I want to wish a happy Juneteenth to everyone. So here on June 18th, we will be discussing this case from the Third Circuit about beards, and everything you might ever want to know about beards is coming up. But first, I want to introduce my colleague and Deputy Director of Litigation at IJ, Bob McNamara. Now, Bob is going to be discussing this case a little later in the program from the Fourth Circuit. And statutes of limitations, if you're not a lawyer, it may sound like kind of a dry subject. Like, do I really want to stick around for that statute? Like, it just sounds like just regular law, right? Well, statute of limitations can be a dry subject if you're a lawyer, but it can also be absolutely terrifying. There probably could be horror movies written about lawyers who blow statutes of limitations. No matter how good your case is, no matter what awesome facts you have, what a good deal you're going to do for your client, if you blow a statute of limitations, it's probably game over for you. So my question for Bob is not whether he's ever blown a statute of limitations. I'm sure that's never happened. But have you ever had to litigate it? Is this something that you've had to spend time on and maybe had a little bit of a terrifyingness to it?
I've definitely spent time on this. In my experience, government defendants believe there are only 2 times a lawsuit can be filed. The lawsuit is either filed too early, and so it's not ripe and you're not allowed to sue, or it's filed too late, and so the statute of limitations is run and you're not allowed to sue. Someday I will manage to file a lawsuit in the magical sweet spot between those 2 poles, and I won't have to have this fight, but I can't recall that ever happening yet.
Yeah, well, and there are many layers to statute of limitations, and of course, yeah, that's one of them. But I'm glad you're still finding your sweet spot. You'll get there one day. But first, we're gonna discuss the sweet spot of a beard, which apparently is no beard at all in some circles. So I'm going to, before we get to Matt Liles, my colleague who's going to discuss this case, a little introduction about a word that some of you may have not heard of before, and I had not heard of before I started researching this week, and that is pogonologia. Pogonologia. 4 O's in a row after a consonant, which is pretty impressive for a word, and it is the study of beards. So here is a something about beards. It is a work on beards from 1786 called Pogonologia, or a philosophical and historical essay on beards. It was by a Frenchman, Jacques-Antoine Delarue, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing incorrectly, who went on to be a major figure in the French Revolution, by the way, but at this point he was in the Ancien regime. He was just writing stuff about beards. And here's what he had to say. When I figure to myself the noble aspect of these great men, when I perceive on their venerable faces the air of gravity, that character of virtues which their long beards express, my imagination catches fire. They no longer appear to me as men, but gods to whom we should bow down. Such is the marvelous effect which this ornament of manhood has produced in all ages, even now that our effeminate customs so justly paint the faculties of our souls, the sight of a long beard still commands respect. So this guy was into beards. And we have this other fellow who I don't think he wears a beard because he thinks he's a god we should bow down to. He's a serious Christian. So I don't think that's true. But he's very much into a beard, so into a beard that he won't shave it for his job, and yet that could infringe upon his religious liberty rights. So, Matt, what's going on with him? He's a firefighter. And he works for a municipal, I believe, firefighting department, which means it's the government, and so the Constitution applies.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, if you're someone who's passionate about facial hair or the Constitution, this is a really interesting case for you.
Or both, perhaps.
Or both at the same time. And I should say, I often have a mustache myself. I don't have one right now. So that's probably just a lack of foresight on my part that would have really elevated the episode.
Although a mustache is okay for these firefighters.
That's true. That's true.
You really should have gone all in and just had the beard, Matt.
I can't really grow one, so...
We're learning all kinds of things on this podcast.
Yeah. And that was Alexander Smith's problem, too. So we'll get into it. Alexander Smith works for the Atlantic City, New Jersey Fire Department. And Atlantic City requires all of its employees who respond to fires to wear air masks that prevent them from being exposed to hazardous or harmful air. That makes a lot of sense. The problem is that the fire department prohibits employees from growing facial hair in a way that inhibits the mask seal. So if you have a beard that's long enough to where when you try to put on the air mask fighting a fire, it inhibits the seal or it causes the seal to come undone after a short period of time, they don't allow that. It seems like the policy as written allows sideburns and mustaches, but it does not allow beards and goatees. And so we get to the plaintiff, a guy named Alexander Smith, who has worked for the Atlantic City Fire Department for 10 years, and he was originally hired to be a firefighter, but is now an air mask technician. So I guess he doesn't really go in and fight the fires himself. He comes on scene, and he stands safely away from the fires, and the firefighters come to him to refill their air masks. He checks the air masks to make sure they're put on correctly. And pretty importantly, like, he doesn't wear an air mask. And he is also an ordained minister of the Christian faith. So he has a sincere belief coming from his faith that men should grow beards for a couple reasons, actually, both to emulate Jesus Christ and the biblical prophets, and to show that they are leaders of the house, leaders of the church, things like that. And of course, and with free exercise law, it's not really the court's job to question the sincerity or correctness of someone's religious beliefs. A court is not going to say, well, actually, according to your church, your beliefs are wrong, or you should believe this.
But Paul in Thessalonians said this, so what are you talking about?
Exactly.
You can't do that.
I actually really liked the footnote in this case pointing out that whether men should grow beards is like a hotly contested point of Christian theology that the court does not want to resolve.
Exactly. I think that might be the first footnote in the case. It says, the Third Circuit does not take a position on whether, Christian men should grow beards or not. So that's a good start.
And a lot of people listening, who are Christians and may think, wait a minute, I never heard about that at my church. But one religious one religion that is much more associated with beards is the Sikh religion, and I see that there were from India, and I see there was some amicus support. There were a lot of amicus briefs in this case, and some were one represented a Sikh coalition, because in their faith, I mean, I think you just always wear a beard. There's certain other aspects that men have to have on their person in that religion, but you just always have the beard. And I know there's been other litigation with Sikhs in various walks of life about whether they can wear a beard too. So this, although, you know, if you're a Christian listening to this and you've never heard of that before, you might think this guy's kind of off his rocker. This thing about having a beard and religion is very much, you know, it's a going concern.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so the plaintiff, Alexander Smith, my understanding is that he, either because he was originally hired as a firefighter or because he's kind of on reserve in case they need more hands to respond to a fire, he's subject to this facial hair policy. And he decides...
it seems like he kind of, I mean, he wants to fight fires too, right? He's not happy with his position, basically.
I don't know.
No,
that's
I
a good
think
question.
He's actually, the whole deal with his job is he's the guy you go to when you want to switch out your air tank. So he, like, definitionally doesn't stand near the smoke. And so he doesn't need a face mask in order to do his job fighting fires.
Maybe I misread that then, but okay.
Well, he requests an accommodation. He goes to the fire department in Atlantic City and says, "I would like to wear a short beard. I believe my religion compels me to do that. And, you know, if you can allow me to abide by this policy and still practice my religion, then that would be great." The Atlantic City Fire Department does not like that. They tell him basically no, and if you come and ask again, we're going to suspend you. And so he decides to sue. He brings several claims. The bulk of the Third Circuit's opinion is about his free exercise claim, and probably most what I'll be talking about. He also brings an equal protection claim and a couple of Title VII religious accommodation and retaliation claims. And importantly, for background, the district court rules in favor of the fire department on all four of Smith's claims. So he appeals and he comes to the Third Circuit with asking for reversal on all four of those claims. And so let's get to the Third Circuit's opinion. It's a little complicated about the panel and what ends up happening. Most of the panel decision is written by Judge Porter, although it seems that he did not write the portion on the Title VII retaliation claim, and he dissents on that. And then we also get a dissent from Judge Chung later on, which I might touch on a little bit. But like I said, the bulk of the Third Circuit's opinion is about his free exercise claim. And if you know anything about free exercise law, it is more or less governed by the Supreme Court's decision in Employment Division versus Smith. So this is a case that is Smith about Smith, like Anthony likes to say.
Smith on Smith.
Smith on Smith. And if you know Smith, you know, in that case, the Supreme Court said that a neutral law of general applicability does not infringe on the free exercise clause. And so if there is a law you are challenging that burdens your religious practice in some way, but is neutral and generally applicable, it is only subject to rational basis review. And if you know rational basis review, you know that means the government pretty much wins. Well, what does the Supreme Court mean by neutral? That basically means, does the law target religion in some way compared to non-religious conduct? What does the Supreme Court mean about general applicability? It basically means, is the law generally applicable? The court has not written a lot on that. The Third Circuit notes that there's a couple things we know about generally applicable. if a law is not generally applicable if it has exceptions or exemptions that undermine what the government says their interest is. And then also a law is probably not generally applicable when government officials just have discretion to grant exemptions or exceptions pretty much however they want.
And those aspects of the generally applicable were kind of tightened up recently by the Supreme Court, right? So that one intonation it seems you get in this opinion is this has come out, say, 10 years ago. It might have looked a lot different than now after the Supreme Court's had a few recent opinions where it's made it basically put Smith in a much smaller box.
I think that's right. If I remember right, after Smith came out, the Supreme Court didn't really touch general applicability for a while until recently. Fulton is a big case from a few years ago on that. And so the Third Circuit, talking about the Atlantic City Fire Department's facial hair policy, they decide not to get at neutrality, and they decide instead to talk about general applicability and decide the case based on that. And the Third Circuit says that the facial hair policy is not generally applicable, and that's for a couple reasons. They say it's certainly true that Atlantic City has an interest in protecting its employees from breathing in harmful air from fires, but it actually has an exemption in its other policies where if you're an administrative employee at the fire department, you don't have to go through like air mask fit testing like a firefighter would. And so they don't actually have to sit you down once a year and make sure that the air mask fits on your face if you're not actually going out fighting fires. And so the Third Circuit says that, this exemption exposes those employees to hazardous air, and that kind of undermines the reason for not giving Alexander Smith his exception from the facial hair policy. Plus, the Third Circuit says that the fire department has another exemption or kind of exception where they say that if you're a captain in the fire department, you can just choose to ignore the air mask or the facial hair policy. And so you can, the language in the policy says you can deviate as long as you accept responsibility for the consequences. And so they're saying, certain employees can just ignore the facial hair policy and grow a beard, but Alexander Smith, who says my religion compels me to have a short beard, you're subject to the policy. You don't get an out.
It was unclear that accept the consequences. Does that just mean like you just don't assign yourself the fires, or does it seem like you just hey, you might die, but you got to accept the consequences?
Well, as I read it, it wasn't just that captains can exempt themselves. Captains just have exemption powers. And this is kind of the dispute between the majority and the dissent of like what exactly captains can exempt you from. But the majority's take is, look, once a captain can exempt you, then it turns into a situation where you ask for an exemption and the captain kind of has to ask, why do you want it? And like that's the moment when the free exercise clause comes into play, because why do you want it could be you say, I want it because I'm a Christian, or you say, I want it because my wife likes it, and the captain has to kind of distinguish between those two things, and that's, according to the majority, where the exemption becomes a problem. Though the dissent, I think, Matt, says that exemption just doesn't exist.
Yeah, that makes sense too, and that creates the Fulton problem of you're giving someone basically unlimited discretion to grant exemptions, and that creates, a risk of animus against people like Alexander Smith. So the Third Circuit majority says, these two features of the fire department's policies mean that the fire department is disfavoring religious practice in a way that, and still also permitting kinds of non-religious conduct that pose the same risks. And for that reason, it's not generally applicable. And then the court has to decide, what level of scrutiny are we giving to this facial hair policy? The parties actually disagree on what level of scrutiny. I think Atlantic City tries to argue that it's intermediate scrutiny because it's not generally applicable, but it's still neutral. So they're trying to be like, meet us halfway and don't apply strict scrutiny, please. And the majority says basically, we've reviewed all the Supreme Court case law. We've reviewed the case law in this circuit. We have never really heard of this, like intermediate scrutiny, because you violate one of the prongs of Smith, but not both. I think there's one case the court mentions about military policy, and they say this is sort of a one-off and doesn't really fit the facts of this case. And so the majority says it's strict scrutiny. The facial hair policy, at least as applied to Smith, has to satisfy strict scrutiny. And if you know about strict scrutiny, that is the opposite of rational basis, and that it is very, very hard for the government to meet that. And that's what happens here. It's normally on narrow tailoring, where it gets pretty tricky for the government to brief that and figure that out. And that's where the court says that it collapses here. They say, the court basically says, we assume Atlantic City has a compelling interest in safety, in not only safety in a really abstract general way, because, under the strict scrutiny test, you have to articulate the government's interests more specifically than just things that kind of float in the air, like safety and, public health and things like that. You have to really narrow it to the facts of the case. The Third Circuit says, well, it's probably true that Atlantic City has a compelling interest in not only safety, but if they get like an overwhelming amount of fire calls and they decide, well, we need everyone that has fire response training to show up, whether or not they're a firefighter, like Alexander Smith is a technician, he's not really supposed to go into the building that's on fire, but if there's just 20 fires going on in Atlantic City at once, it's probably true that Atlantic City has a strong interest in forcing Alexander Smith to go out there. But then they say this policy is not narrowly tailored. There are ways for Atlantic City to meet that interest without burdening Alexander Smith's religious practice. The most interesting point they say here, at least to me, is, well, the fire department could at least just try to put an air mask on Alexander Smith after he grows his beard. I think the court basically says you haven't even tried to see if the mask would stay on his face if he grew his beard out like he wants. And they cite a case where I think from the District of D.C. where they actually tried this with someone who is a Muslim and said, I want to grow a beard, and they actually put the face mask on him, and I guess it worked. So
yeah, because there's beards and there's, like I can remember, if you have a hipster lumberjack beard, that might be a little difficult. But if it's just a close-shaven, pretty short beard, then it's probably going to be better.
Yeah. And as far as I know, I think the opinion describes Alexander Smith's desired beard as short.
It's a quarter inch. He's
right.
very specific about, I think he wants a big, bushy, Old Testament beard, but his compromise position is I'll grow a quarter inch beard so you can still put a thing on my face.
Right. Yeah. A quarter inch does not sound bad at all. I don't know. But I've never worn an air mask, so.
Though neither does Alexander Smith.
That's true.
Can we talk about the retaliation claim in this case? Because the retaliation claim, I think, is amazing, right? Alexander Smith doesn't fight fires. He has not been asked to fight fires. His whole job is not to fight fires, but instead to switch out the air tanks. And after he sues, saying hey, I don't even have to wear these masks. It's no fair to not let me have a beard when I don't wear a mask. In 2020, Atlantic City is hey, just for today, Alexander Smith, you have to come fight fires because we have nobody else to fight fires. And first of all, they claim they have no one else to fight fires. When Alexander Smith says, I don't fight fires, I haven't been trained to fight fires, they call somebody else. So they had somebody else. And then also, nothing caught on fire that day when they needed emergency firefighters. So that is my favorite claim in this case. Can we discuss that one?
We can. And if I understand this right, it's Judge Porter is not the one who writes that section of the majority. He actually dissents.
Yeah,
on the
they
retaliation
don't put it in the headings like they do, like when the Supreme Court does this kind of thing. But it says at the very beginning of the case that section is, he doesn't do that section.
And Bob, you probably understood this better than me, but the majority says that they don't find causation between his accommodation request and the fact that they called him up in 2020 to fight the tropical storm.
Right, like his claim is basically like, I sued saying my job doesn't involve wearing these masks, and a year and a half later, you, out of the blue, and like breaking with decades of practice of the way you deploy your firefighters, said, well, today, sir, you have to wear a mask. And that seems an awful lot like you're punishing me for suing you by sending me into a fire I haven't practiced how to fight so that I'll burn to death. And like, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to do that when people sue you. And the majority says, well, sure, that's weird, and it does seem like maybe they're lying about why they did it, but you sued them 18 months before they did this. Why would we assume? And, it's important to remember, this is in the context of summary judgment. We're not asking whether they definitely did this to retaliate. We're just asking whether you could plausibly think this like one wild day when they tried to contrive a way to make him put a face mask on maybe had something to do with the lawsuit he filed about not wearing a face mask.
Yeah. And an interesting point, too, is apparently Atlantic City has not made an air mask technician go fight a fire in decades.
Yeah, just on this one day when they had an emergency that turned out to not involve any fires.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one.
It's odd that the one judge peeled off that, because I know you haven't discussed this part, Matt, but he did win on the meat of his Title VII claim, or at least he'll get to keep going with it. But then he loses on the retaliation. So the judge who belongs to all the majority, who doesn't write separately, decided to go to one and not the other. It just seems like an interesting decision.
Yeah, and I won't imagine to know anything at all about Title VII other than what's in this opinion, but that is interesting. The Third Circuit reverses the district court on his accommodation claim. Basically saying, everyone agrees that Alexander Smith has a facial accommodation claim. And so all Atlantic City has to do is say, well, it would just be an unjustifiable, undue hardship on us to allow him to grow this beard. And they just can't. And part of that is because no air mask technician has been called to fight a fire in decades. And apparently no other employees were seeking accommodations from the facial hair policy.
So you have to give him an accommodation, but maybe you can retaliate against him too. It's kind of the message.
Yeah, maybe you can.
You have to let him grow the beard, but as punishment, you can make him go into a burning building. That's, I think, the outcome of this case.
That's pretty much the outcome of the case. That's pretty much it. There's some good language in the free exercise portion about how religious freedom is not a second-class right, how religious freedom is kind of a fundamental, one of our first freedoms. So if you're someone who likes, good poetic language about constitutional rights like I do, then it's worth the reading. And they get into equal protection at the end. They affirm the district court and say that Alexander Smith hasn't won on his equal protection claim. That's not quite as interesting, but then the Third Circuit does enter a preliminary injunction that the district court had originally denied based on both his free exercise and Title VII accommodation claims. So still a pretty big win for Alexander Smith, I think.
Bob, other thoughts you have on this?
I think this is one of those cases that comes off as a dispute about like high-minded religious liberty, but at bottom, the dispute between the majority and the dissent on free exercise is actually just a factual dispute. The majority says there's this policy where you can exempt people from the facial hair policy, and that necessarily violates City of Fulton. And the dissent doesn't say no, they're allowed to do it. The dissent just says, no, that's not the policy. Actually, captains can't do that. And it just seems like that that's probably a question that has an answer one way or another. I don't pretend to know what the answer is, but for all of the sort of highfalutin back and forth about the nature of the free exercise clause and religious rights, it seems like at bottom this is just a fact dispute. It's a fact dispute about the retaliation. It seems like it's a fact dispute about whether there's an exemption policy. And I sometimes wonder, like, I often read appellate opinions where there is this deep dispute about facts, and it just strikes me that, like, the venue in our judicial system where we resolve disputes about facts is not supposed to be, like, dueling appellate opinions. Like, don't we just need a jury and some witnesses to tell us whether they have an exemption policy or not?
Yeah, and the appeal here was from summary judgment, which is supposed to have undisputed facts. But as we know, sometimes there's summary judgment and sometimes there's summary judgment. I wonder if to some extent the majority, that could be worked out by just remanding and having a trial. But while the case is there and the majority wants to straighten out some law that it thinks that the district court had got wrong, and so it doesn't want to do that kind of that full-throated remand. Well, one case that has also been remanded is in the Fourth Circuit. It is about this, as I said, boring-sounding subject of statute of limitations.
Way to sell it, Anthony.
But this is a case that has some pretty chilling facts in it, and also has just some odd, we'll get into this, some odd facts about the law in South Carolina and some weird laws that states pass to protect their own governments that are kind of a head scratcher, or maybe not so much a head scratcher actually. But Bob, what's going on here? ER versus Beaufort. I might be pronouncing that
Beaufort.
Beaufort. Sorry, County School District.
Yeah, ER v. Beaufort County School District is a Title IX case. Title IX allows for lawsuits against entities that accept government funding, schools that accept government funding, and allow certain kinds of sexual abuse or sexual discrimination. And so ER is a student in the public schools down in Beaufort, and she alleges that she was sexually harassed and sexually abused by multiple fellow male students, and the school knew, and the school did nothing to protect her, and that's a Title IX violation. And so she sues under Title IX. But Title IX, kind of in keeping with a lot of the civil rights statutes Congress has seen fit to pass, gives people a cause of action. It gives them a right to sue, but it doesn't come attached to a statute of limitations. It doesn't say anything about when people are allowed to sue. And what the Supreme Court has said in this context is, we have to have a statute of limitations. Statutes of limitations are important because they're how people know what their rights are. They're how people know what their risks are. And so we have to have clear rules. And when Congress doesn't give us a statute of limitations, what you're supposed to do is just reach out and use whatever state law statute of limitations is most analogous to whatever the claim is, unless the analogous one doesn't make sense for federal purposes and you should figure it out. And so ER files this lawsuit, and the school district says, well, we're a school district, we're the government, and in South Carolina, if you want to sue the government for committing a tort against you, you're under the South Carolina Tort Act, Government Tort Act, which has a 2-year statute of limitations. So you, like every other civil rights plaintiff in the universe, have filed your lawsuit too late. You're outside the statute of limitations, and it should be dismissed. And ER, for her part, says, no, this is a claim about a sexual assault. And under South Carolina law, when a minor is sexually assaulted, her statute of limitations doesn't run until she turns 27. So I've got tons of time. I don't know what you're talking about. The analogy is not to the government defendant. The analogy is to the thing that happened to me, which was sexual assault. So the district court dismisses the case, says government defendant is the most analogous. And it goes up to the Fourth Circuit, and the Fourth Circuit says, look, you are making this far too complicated. We know the Supreme Court said you should find the most analogous statute of limitations, but they didn't really mean look for the most analogous. They meant look for the most obvious one. And so it should just be the baseline tort statute of limitations, which in South Carolina is 3 years, And just across the board, that's what we should use to make it, less complicated. And so what it leaves us with is a rule of law that says statutes of limitations are important because they're how people know what their rights are, and they're how people know what their risks are, and so they should be clear. And the only way to figure out what the statute of limitations is for a given federal civil rights statute in a given state is to litigate it all the way through an appeal, because it will never be clear in advance. And it always strikes me when I run across these cases and these disputes, which happen all the time, that this is just such an easy problem for Congress to fix. Like, we're asking about statutes of limitations, which usually implies that there's a statute setting out the limitations, and there just isn't. Congress doesn't set them. And so courts are left to do this sort of like common law finding. And, even in the Fourth Circuit, the opinion here in the ER case says, well, we want to be clear and we want to be simple, so it should just be like the background default tort statute of limitations. Well, unless it's a statute that really has a direct analogy in state law. And Title IX doesn't, because Title IX is about when you accept federal funds. But who's to say about other federal statutes? We have to leave ourselves an escape hatch. That it just seems like the easiest solution is just for Congress to do what legislatures that create causes of action are supposed to do and figure out for itself what it wants the statute of limitations to be. And I don't really have a theory for why Congress consistently refuses to do that, but the statute of limitations that attaches to almost any federal civil rights cause of action is just a mystery that's going to vary by what state you're in, what statute you're invoking, and speaking of lawyers being terrified, as a plaintiff's lawyer who is looking at a brand new federal civil rights cause of action, I don't know how you go about like handicapping which local cause of action an appellate court is eventually going to tell you is the correct analogy.
Yeah, and if you're a good attorney, you're just going, and you get the case in time, you're just going to file the earliest one you can, the earliest one that might apply. And so therefore, sometimes this doesn't get tested for a while because it's maybe the attorney who wasn't as on the ball, or the plaintiff who wasn't on the ball when it actually happens.
Oh, yeah, and it is, it's very easy, I think, in the abstract to look at these cases and say, 2 years is a long time. Like, why can't you file a lawsuit in 2 years? But the actual reality is it takes normal people a long time to even find their way to the right lawyer. You have to find a lawyer who knows what Title IX is, who knows how to litigate a Title IX case, which takes some time. People don't always know that. The lawyer then has to do kind of due diligence and make sure that, he's filing a lawsuit where the allegations are true, where he actually thinks this happened. And those months add up really quickly. So there's a huge difference between a 2-year statute of limitations and a 3, 4, 5-year statute of limitations, because we're not talking about, necessarily legally sophisticated people who have a lawyer on retainer. And the instant the harm comes, they call their lawyer, and the lawyer says, here's a memo with your 5 best causes of action. Like, it takes time for people to even get things in gear, to have a lawyer start looking at their case. And so it really does matter what the statute of limitations is. And it matters knowing that in advance, because you walk into a lawyer's office and you say, this terrible thing happened to my daughter. And the lawyer looks at the calendar and he's like, well, I could file a good case, but there's also this uncertain risk that in 2 months I can't file a case at all. So let's just shoot from the hip.
Right. Matt, have you had the honor of researching statute of limitations since you left law school?
I have a little bit. I'm aware that for Section 1983 claims, you borrow from just kind of the general personal injury tort statutes of limitations. I haven't litigated it. Reading this opinion, it kind of comes off like this was just the easiest way to decide the question, and that's why it was done that way. But it doesn't seem like the most obvious one as a litigator or as a party either.
Well, and I think where the court's coming from is it's kind of nuts to demand the most analogous statute of limitations, because then we'll never know what it is. But I mean, even in the 1983 context, the rule is you borrow the state personal injury statute of limitations unless it's too short. And what's too short? Well, no one really knows. You have to litigate that. And so it is just like, it's one of those things where you could just, like, Congress could pass a statute that just writes down the number 4, and then we'd all know the number was 4, and we'd stop having to do this, and they won't do it.
And there are a couple states, right, where the general statute of limitations is literally a year.
Right, and it's actually a live question in civil rights litigation, is like, at what point does the state general tort statute of limitations get so short that actually you can't reasonably file a complicated civil rights lawsuit in that time? And that it's something the Supreme Court has not grappled with, and that it will have to grapple with unless, somehow Congress actually manages to pass a general federal statute of limitations, which I would not hold my breath.
One thing I was surprised. So this was a short and sweet and very logical opinion, which I like. But one thing that they didn't cite, I was a little surprised they didn't cite, is one of my favorite cases, Felder versus Casey, from 1988 at the Supreme Court. And this is a case where they litigated in a place where I've had fun litigating, Wisconsin, where it was in federal court, but they borrowed the argument was you have to use the federal, the state process for suing the government, which is where you have to file a notice of claim, and then that notice of claim is usually denied, but I guess sometimes it isn't, by the governmental entity. And then after you get that, then you can actually sue. And they said, the Supreme Court says that, look, you can't apply that to Section 1983 claims, because then that's importing all this other specific. You're discriminating against federal claims, and so you just need the general statute of limitations, like Bob just described. And so the argument in this case is, well, you should apply the South Carolina suing the government statute of limitations, which seems just like basically a notice of. It's less onerous, but it's still the same idea that, well, this is the government. And so you get the government statute of limitations, just like you'd have to do the notice of claim procedure for in Wisconsin. And it seems that's pretty obvious. You wouldn't apply that. Now, this is a Title IX case where I guess the statute of limitations case law is a little less developed in Section 1983, but both these federal civil rights statutes that are pretty straightforward in terms of, suing. So I was a little surprised that didn't come up.
I mean, it does sound like the plaintiffs made that argument. Like, if the plaintiffs' lawyers are listening,
I bet they
don't think they
Felder
missed
in their
it.
briefs. Yeah.
Well, and it is the Fourth Circuit kind of drops a footnote that says, like, look, the plaintiff argues that South Carolina, just as a matter of like the supremacy of federal law, can't pass a statute that immunizes itself from these federal statutes. But we don't have to reach that because we just decide that that's a stupid way to do it anyway. And they're correct in pointing out that, well, then, because Title IX applies to private schools that accept government funding, just like it applies to public schools, you'd have one Title IX statute of limitations for private schools, you'd have a different one for public schools, and we don't want to mess with any of that. And so we don't really care what's most analogous. We care what's easiest and most straightforward. But I think the more difficult question of whether a state can do this or whether courts can be bound by state laws like this is subsumed with the easier answer of just like, well, we're not. We don't have to look at it, and so we're not going to decide whether it's possible to be bound by it.
So the more philosophical question I'd like to bring up, maybe to close with, is something I've thought about in when I've looked at these cases in the past about federal statutes that they didn't include a time limit, right? Congress didn't include a time limit. So I get when a lot of this litigation was going in, say, the 60s, 70s, 80s. Federal courts were into doing things like, we'll borrow this from state law, we'll borrow from this other statute. Maybe Congress is like actual motivations were this from the legislative history, right? So these days we live in the age of textualism, and the Congress says what Congress says, and that's the law. What about the argument that there isn't a statute of limitations? Congress would have said so if they wanted to. It's not in there, and so you can sue 15 years later. It's fine. If Congress wants to put it in there, like you said, Bob, they can amend the statute. I mean, I don't think the Supreme Court would, go full textualist and do that, because that would lead to some interesting results. But it's kind of in keeping with, what they've been saying lately.
No, I mean, it makes sense as a textualist matter that, like, if Congress wanted this to be limited, they would have put a limitation in the statute. And so you can't create a statute of limitations without a statute. And like, honestly, the world might be a better place if the court did do that, because I'm quite sure Congress would instantly respond by passing a statute of limitations, which they could have just done in the first place. But it is one of, like, it is foreclosed by precedent. This is how the court has decided we're going to interpret Congress's utter failure to give us a statute of limitations. And so we're left with the kludge, but it is important to, like, just to say out loud that the kludge is worse than Congress just doing its job and giving us a clear rule. And maybe someday somebody should do something about that.
That's right. Well, if you're listening out there and you're interested, write your congressman a postcard, and maybe we can get this fixed. But in the meantime, I'm very glad that you're watching or listening to Short Circuit with my colleagues today. Thank you guys for coming on, and thank you. And please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And remember to get engaged.